Gacha games, there are a lot of them, and they vary in size and quality, and depending on what they're aiming for, they might vary in their overall purpose and the main appeal of them. For instance, some may choose to focus solely on character design, while others may choose to focus on the personality. Others could also choose to focus instead on the gameplay, and there are many different aspects. I mean, one thing we can all agree on is every gacha game has good music. I think that's just a basic factor you need to have. That is a foundation and a requirement to be a decent gacha game, is to have good music. Because I fail to understand how every gacha game I've played, or at least every successful gacha game I've played, just happens to have good music otherwise. With that being said though, I briefly mentioned this in the Arknights video, but I think it's incredibly difficult to find consistency, not necessarily in the game itself, but in the community. So this video is going to go over the community and how it can heavily impact a game. We're going to talk about Arknights, but we're also going to branch out into Genshin and into Blue Archive. Those are the three primary ones I play and the three primary communities I've interacted with. If you do find yourself enjoying this video, consider leaving a like down below and subscribing to the channel and heading over to the Discord server. Now, one thing I want to clarify and mention before I even go into the video is the statements that I make in this video about communities are not indicative of the entirety of a game's community. Instead, only the portion that I've interacted with, and your interactions and your experiences can differ entirely. So please don't let what I say here deter you from playing a game or deter you from interacting with that game's community. And I also don't recommend letting one or a few small interactions deter you from interacting with the rest of a game's community. Instead, they could be very small interactions that were relatively bad compared to an overall positive experience that you could have. Now, moving on into it, games communities can differ dramatically from one to another. These aren't just any interactions you'll have, but also on the content creator side of things, whether that be on YouTube or Twitch. The presence and type of content that is created, they can dramatically alter your perspective and change the new player experience. An example that I like to bring up is that if you were to start Genshin Impact today as a brand new player with no help and no friends that play it whatsoever, you are incredibly likely to be able to search up on YouTube whatever you're confused about and get a pretty consecutive and pretty concise guide that clearly explains what you should be doing and why. And as much as individuals may not like to hear it, this is what, in my opinion at least, makes Genshin Impact one of the easiest gacha games to start. Not necessarily because the game itself isn't super complex, but instead because there's a wealth of guides and information out there that you can look for. And it's basically on any platform, on Reddit, on Discord, on YouTube, on Twitch. You can ask anybody and they are very likely to at least be able to help you in some regard. Even the average Genshin player is likely to know some information they can impart onto you. And while I'm aware that there are some surface level things like, team compositions, there's even further deeper aspects such as elemental reactions that you're going for, specific stats you're building for and aiming for, ratios you want, different combinations as to why you would run one weapon like Favonius over another. And it makes Genshin have one of the lighter new player experiences because at the beginning, the resin system doesn't matter. You don't really have hard content that you're trying to do, and instead you're just trying to explore the map, build up your roster of characters, and get through the story. And you have guides for every step of the way. Compare that to Blue Archive, and you don't really have that. One of the biggest issues with Blue Archive is that because the community itself is so small, you don't necessarily have the resources or guides to understand what the game either is failing to teach you or what you fail to pay attention to. Whether that's on the player or on developers, I won't say. Now, admittedly, I play Blue Archive, and I have played it for quite a while. I can push into pretty difficult content, but I don't play the game very seriously. I don't understand many of the mechanics, and that's not to say Blue Archive is an easy game, but instead to say that I do have a lot of characters of higher rarity. And it subsequently feeds into an aspect where if you are starting out in Blue Archive, it's much more difficult to find the guides and resources you need. And sure, there are some out there here and there, but ultimately I don't think any of them are as clear and concise as the ones in the other communities, whether they be Arknights, Azure Lane, or Genshin Impact. And the game itself doesn't necessarily do a good job of explaining a lot of concepts to you. It's why you hear me talk about Blue Archive's story so much, because I can't talk about the gameplay, unfortunately. Meanwhile, you have Arknights, and Arknights is a bit of a difficult situation. If you're in the Discord server, in my Discord server at least, you know that there's quite a lot of information that can be found in the help channels, even the general section of the Arknights channel. And that category is willing to provide you with useful information because we have quite a lot of new players starting out in that game. And ultimately what this leads to is a lot of new players finding a bunch of information they can use, finding clear and concise guides, and whilst there are as many guides for Arknights as there are for Genshin Impact, the guides are still very useful. I think Arknights is in the middle ground for that experience. Arknights doesn't necessarily have the wealth of resources that Genshin has in terms of the YouTube aspect of things or Reddit and so on, but doesn't necessarily have the limited amount of content and limited amount of guides that Blue Archive does. And the players themselves know enough information to generally guide newer players to the game, and this alleviates the tension of new people coming in and not knowing who to summon for or who to pull for or what's good and what's not and who to build. So, if I'm talking about just the new player experience, I would say that Genshin ranks first among them, and followed by Arknights, followed by Blue Archive. Blue Archive has the worst new player experience, but it's arguably one of the easier games, with Arknights having a complex system that also has a pretty decent wealth of resources and guides out there, and Genshin Impact having an easier system to master with a large amount of guides out there. Keep in mind, this is not to say that any gacha game is better than the other. I think they're all equally good, and I don't think that one is way better than the other. If you play any one of these games, good. I suggest you try the others, but they're all great in my opinion. But what about the community side of things? I mentioned previously that one of the reasons that Arknights players play their game so much and like Arknights as a whole, and why it's such a recommended game, is because of its consistency in terms of quality. What about the other side of things? What if we're taking a look at the people of each game's community? Well, that's when things kind of shift a bit. I could solely focus on the negatives and I could solely focus on the positives. I could say that every Arknights player learns and has so much information that they're really useful and really helpful to teaching new players. I could say that Genshin players have such a wide amount of resources in terms of information on YouTube and a wide amount of information and experiences on their own. They're pretty helpful to guiding new players along a pretty decent path of who are the best units to summon for versus what unit to do. And I could say that Blue Archive players, they like their game. I don't think many of them actually understand half of the mechanics of the game, but hey, they like the game. And you know what? It's the opinion that counts. But if we're looking at the negative side of things, I think the lewd nature of the Blue Archive community can turn a lot of individuals away because they're less inclined to think about the characterization and the story of the game and more inclined to just see it as the game with a lot of porn made for it. And you know what? You can kind of see that in a lot of different areas, and I do think it kind of deters and detracts away from the whole experience of Blue Archive, but you know. And no, this isn't saying that the meta or anything else is superior to the waifu aspects of the game. Instead, I'm just saying that the game's community can be iffy depending on who you are. With Arknights, I think there's a lot of players who have a weird sense of elitism, to an extent where many of them will look down on other games, and this isn't for all Arknights players, it's just for some, and believe the game to be really good. Which belief in a game isn't bad, and belief in your own game for being good isn't bad either. What I'm trying to say is though that talking down on other games can deter other players from trying yours. Genshin players, look, there's not endgame announced. And I think the amount of disdain people have for that does deter a lot of individuals from trying the game out in the first place, because negative opinions do really turn people away from games. I've experienced this recently whilst playing Destiny 2. Destiny 2 players hate their own game, and it does really make the experience worse. I'm not going to say the Genshin community is bad or they're negative or they're really bad on Twitter or anything else, because instead what I think it's incredibly important to realize is that the Genshin community is much larger than the Arknights and the Blue Archive community. So if 5% of each of those communities is negative, the Genshin's 5% is going to outweigh heavily the Arknights and the Blue Archive community's 5% because of the size difference overall. It's like comparing 5% of a million versus 5% of 100 versus 5% of 1,000, or even 5% of 10,000. There's such a wide difference between them that it's unfair to compare all of them. Yes, you are more inclined to have a negative experience with Genshin and the Genshin community, not because the game itself is bad or because the community is bad, but instead because of how large the community is. I want the individuals in each of these games to get along. I don't like the idea of one game being branded as good, the other being branded as bad, because I think they're all great and they all have extremely good qualities and none of them excel in everything. Like, if you want my blunt opinion, I play Genshin Impact the most. I play it daily. I also have now started to play Arknights daily. Blue Archive, in my opinion, has the best characterization. Arknights has the most mentally involving gameplay. And Genshin Impact, I have the most fun with. So generally, it's about what you enjoy. And ultimately, I do want to hear your opinions as well. So if you enjoy different games, maybe I didn't go over or haven't played on the channel before, leave it in the comment section down below. But overall, hope you've enjoyed. If you did, consider subscribing, leaving a like on the video down below, and consider joining the Discord server. And with that being said, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.